Thank you very much for the honor of participating in such a prestigious symposium, especially the members. I challenge my good friend Asgard in terms of the members here. I'm an African, I'm an ultramarathon, and I don't know how many else there are, so we do have some diversity on the panel. I hope you can understand my accent. Okay, straight to the point. What I'd like to do is to briefly mention how we define mental illness, how mental illness is defined in terms of Jewish law, and how the Jewish law is sensitive to those with mentally ill. I understand I have the graveyard slot in the graveyard session, so I just hope, just bear with me. So how do we define mental illness? What's fascinating is that the definition of mental illness, according to Jewish law, is very similar to the definition of mental illness, how we define it now. Mental illness can be defined as some kind of disturbance in thought, emotions or behavior that affects function. And that's what's critical, the fact that it affects function. About 3 years ago, I was asked to teach research to a group of psychiatry residents. I said, let's do some research. So we took a group of 300 psychiatrists who were meeting here in Israel, and we asked them to self-evaluate themselves according to the 30 mental illnesses that we have according to DSM. So from a scale of 0 to 5, what percentage of psychiatrists admitted that they had some form of mental illness? 100%? That's a lot. 10%? 5%? 89% said they had some form of mental illness. I'm one of the 11% that's completely okay, but 89% that's that form. But not 5, maybe 2, 3. And the point is that's part of the human condition. Everyone has a bit of depression, a bit of anxiety, a bit of personality, sometimes obsessive, sexual issues, eating disorders. The question is, does it affect your function? And that's what's critical to the question here. Because there's also JPN, just plain nuts. Some people are just a little strange. The question is, how much does it affect the function? So the Jewish definition of mental illness, as we know, is closest, or psychosis, when a person is out of touch with reality, is closest to the concept of what we know as the shoteh. So what's the shoteh? The shoteh, the first description in the Bible itself comes with King David, where he feigned, he acted if he was crazy, running away from who we know is running off, from King Saul, and acting went to Melech Achish. But the definition of mental illness itself, the best one is in Chagiga, in Masechet Chagiga, in the tractate, where it says that there are 3 definitions essentially of the behavior of a shoteh: those who go out alone at night, who spends a night in a cemetery, tears his clothes, and then the 4th one is given a qualified, destroys, or that gives him. What's important, it becomes a discussion. Do you need just one of them, or do you need all of them? And the Talmud decides at the end, the decision is essentially, even one of them could be okay, but it has to be done in a crazy way. Derech shtut. And that's what's important, that things have to be done and it's a definition of how we see things. It's the behavior. There are other criteria that are given according to others, for example, Maimonides. But once again, it's the behavior that's critical. And what's fascinating is that we see that the definition of mental illness is once again according to behavior. It's a symptom-oriented definition rather than something that's etiological or unobservable or subjective patient account. What I see is what counts. And what's fascinating now is that the definition of, for example, the illnesses we have today exactly is what's there in the Talmud. Why? Because it's what I see that's important. And that's how diagnose mental illness. It's the only field of medicine that's like that. Every other field, for example, diabetes, I define diabetes based on the fact that there's glucose intolerance or problem with insulin. Not in psychiatry. In psychiatry, I define my illnesses based on what I see. There are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is because we really don't know what's going on in the brain. We really don't know what causes the illnesses. The difference between psychiatry and neurology is that in psychiatry, in neurology, they know exactly what causes the illnesses, but no treatment. I mean, that's simplicity, but we're the opposite. We haven't a clue what causes our illnesses, but we have treatment in many cases. So there are 3 halakhic concepts, or 3 Jewish law concepts of the shoteh, the psychotic individuals. There's a shoteh gamur, the complete shoteh. There's itim chalem itim shoteh, which is the person who comes in and out of psychosis. And then there's shoteh ledavar echad. And that's how the Talmud defines these 3 different types. And what's fascinating is, once again, it's an observable thing. So when I look into our patients now, and I can see these definitions, the shoteh gamur is a schizophrenia, the person with schizophrenia. The itim chalem is a person with mood disorders or bipolar. or manic depression. The delusional disorders is the shoteh ledavar echad, just in one particular circumscribed area. So, and the way that, for example, the shoteh gamur is described is exactly as I see the schizophrenia patient today. And what's fascinating is that the definition is what is there as what is in a diagnosis of the DSM today. For example, prominent thought disorder, the fact that patients with schizophrenia don't feel pain. It's there in the Talmud, and we see it today. We don't really know why that is, but it's really true. The fact that movement disorders, and also, once again, there's no description of auditory hallucinations in the Talmud. There is today, but why is that? Because it's something you can't observe, so therefore it doesn't go in the definition. Mood disorders, itim chalem, itim shoteh, when a person comes in and out of psychosis, which means that when they're psychotic, all the laws of the shoteh, of the psychotic individual, applies while they're psychotic, but when they come out of it, then once again, all the laws apply to them once again. And the best example is given when on Passover, on Pesach, when a person eats matzah, when they're in a psychotic state, when they are exempt from Jewish law, when, let's say, they get their medication 2 hours later and come out of that state, they have to eat the matzah again. Why? Because in the state that they ate it, they weren't required to keep the law. And when they came out of the state 2 hours later, they were, so they have to eat it again. Delusional disorder, we don't have time to really get into that, but that's one circumscribed area, and the Rabbanim, the sages, have different understandings of how to do that. Are they really hiding symptoms, etc.? And then there's a concept of brief psychotic disorder, where you need at least 2 to 3 events. Now, these are all important when we come to deciding on how to approach this. Now, the boundaries aren't always clear, so people come in and out, potentially, of these different concepts. It's important that we have a combination of doctors and the law, the Rabbanim or the Beit Din, the courts, to decide. Now, there are 3 situations that are very similar to the psychotic individual, and that's the mental retarded, the drunk, when the person is very drunk, that's like the person is psychotic, but that doesn't mean that they're exempt. And we say that when they become drunk, they're responsible for the behavior, but at the time that they're drunk, they're not. But so when it comes to punishment, they're responsible. And the third one is a bad temper. We don't have time to really go into that, but essentially when a person has a really bad temper, that's also considered to be like a psychotic individual. And what's interesting here is here, once again, we see a combination of the doctors and the courts. That the doctors called upon to give understanding of the competency of a person to act and what's going on with them, but essentially who defines a person as a shoteh, whether he can function in a certain way, it's the court or the Beit Din. And that's exactly the way the situation is today. For example, in hospital today, if a person says, I prefer to die rather than my gangrenous leg being amputated. So doctors call upon to say, does this person have the competency to make that decision? Is he psychotic? Because essentially it's his body, he can decide whatever he wants. But at the end of the day, who decides whether that operation is done by force or not, and to allow the person? It's the courts. And it's the exact same concept with the shoteh that we have today. So the shoteh is not a clinical definition, but rather a legal concept defined by the Beit Din. So now I want to give a few examples of how Halacha demonstrates exquisite sensitivity to the shoteh in the few minutes that we have today. So the shoteh's status in Halacha is compared to the katan and the cheresh, the young person, and the difficult how to define the cheresh today, but essentially the person who we say is out of contact with what's going on around him. It's sometimes very simplistically defined as someone who's deaf, but it's not so clear that that's really what we're talking about. But essentially, the shoteh is someone who lacks understanding. So they're exempt from various commandments, and once again, as I mentioned, they're exempt from punishment as well. So when it comes to agency, if a person is psychotic, we can't rely on them to carry out certain acts for us. But if they're being checked, if they're being watched, if they're under some kind of supervision, they can do that. So if someone is not required to carry out certain things, they cannot, for example, blow the shofar for me if they themselves aren't required to do that. On just one example. However, when it comes to kosher slaughter, shechita, if I'm there standing next to the shoteh, he can carry out the act if I'm there making sure that he's doing it in a proper way. So agency is allowed. And when it comes to marriage and divorce, that's another fascinating. For marriage and divorce, you have to have some kind of understanding at the time you're getting married, what you're getting into. So we say that a person who's psychotic, was in a shoteh, who's out of touch with reality, is not in a situation where they can get married. So too, they can't get divorced, because you have to understand at the time of what you're doing it, what you're doing. And that's why you can't, here, the person, you have to understand what's going into it. So a person with the shoteh can't get married and can't get divorced. So what happens when the person gets married in a state that they are able to get married, and then they suddenly become psychotic, and now they can't get divorced because they don't have agency, or they don't have the competency to get divorced because they lack understanding at the time. Now, in the olden days, that was a big problem. The biggest problem actually is in the Levirate marriage, because in the Levirate marriage, where a woman whose husband dies, there's no children, she becomes automatically married to the brother of her husband. Now that's an automatic process. You don't need to have understanding for that. But to get out of that, the religion, Jewish law allows a woman to get out of that. To get out of that, you have to have understanding. So a woman is stuck, because now she's automatically married to her brother-in-law, but she can't get out of it. But that's not an issue today. Why is it not an issue today? Because in 1952, we got medication. And in 1952, we have the ability to bring a person out of a state of psychosis to the state that they can understand what they're doing at the time. So therefore, this is kind of information that needs to be described and shared with rabbinical courts. So lacking responsibility is another issue. So when we say when someone who's psychotic finds something, or shoteh, it's considered to be stolen or belong to someone else, so they can't really own it. But on the other hand, and we also can't allow them to be involved in business, to safeguard the people in the community. But on the other hand, while we safeguarding the community, we also safeguarding the rights of the psychotic individual. Because what happens if a woman is now psychotic and the man wants to now get remarried? So he can just say, okay, I'm just divorcing my wife and I'm moving on, and she's going to be alone. So Jewish law says you're not allowed to divorce a woman who's psychotic, who's in the state of shoteh. You can't divorce her because someone needs to look after her. But at the same time, what about this poor man who's now stuck with someone who's out of touch with reality, who potentially in psychiatry hospital for the rest of her life? So we allow him to remarry with permission of what they call the 100 rabbis, and that's a whole discussion in itself. There are certain social obligations to the shoteh. Someone who's shoteh, we have to help them be part of the community. For example, if someone's in a state of shoteh, we have to help them purify themselves. In the cases when there was in the days of the temple, to eat truma if they are kohen, if one of the priests. So the community has an obligation to enable someone who's psychotic to become a member of society and participate in various functions. I want to just give a few examples of halacha where once again we safeguard the rights of the individual with mental illness as well as the community. So let's say someone's in a state of psychosis and they can't look after their family. A man is in the state, and what about his family? So the court's allowed to take away money from his bank account and give it to his family. The court's allowed to take 10% away from his earnings without him knowing, because he's in a state of psychosis, without his agreement, his informed consent. Why? Because it's obvious that everyone gives 10% of their money to tzedakah, to charity, so you can do that automatically. Restraint. You're not allowed to really restrain. You're not allowed to restrain a person. And definitely not a parent, but in case of saving life, you can. You're allowed to if therapy for the patient is involving doing something that's not prescribed by Jewish law, for example, eating kosher food, eating non-kosher food, you're allowed to give them non-kosher food, but you should try to do it. What about forced psychiatric treatment? Am I allowed to force treatment on a person? So once again, we can talk for hours on that, but in Israel, there's actually a difference of opinion between the law in the national law and Jewish law. For here, Jewish law would state that if a person requires treatment, they refuse it, you can force treatment to them from the concept of zakin adam shelo b'fanav, it's a meritorious thing to do something for someone in their interest. So looking at the best interest, and that actually with respect to some of the previous speakers. We don't have time to go into that, but that essentially that's a concept of the tzitzilias in which we use today. But however, where there's a difference of opinions, where according to law in Israel, you have to be psychotic and an acute danger to your souls. Where Jewish law says no, even an acute danger to your souls, without being psychotic, you can force treatment. So, for example, when someone comes to my emergency room and they're severely depressed and suicidal, they're going to jump off the building, but they refuse treatment, according to Israeli law, I have to let them leave the emergency room and jump off the building. It's not like that in New York, by the way. In Israel, it's very, very sensitive to autonomy of the patient. Jewish law said, no, you can force treatment. The person's severely depressed and they're going to suicide. You have to force treatment. Israeli law says, no, you've got to let them go and jump off the building. How we deal with that is another story. When a person attempts suicide, they don't say Birkat Guma. Whenever a person is saved from some kind of a serious mental illness or serious illness, physical illness, or in a state of danger, they say the special blessing that they're being saved. But if it involves a suicide, according to some of our sages, for example, the Tzitz Eliezer, we do not say Birkat Guma, the blessing for being saved. Pregnancy termination, you can terminate pregnancy for the sensitivity of the person, for psychological reasons, if the person's potentially in danger. So we allow that. Medical confidentiality can be broken in the case of mental illness. For example, the courts have forced doctors to provide information about their patients in order to dissolve marriages. Because let's say a person is psychotic and they can't get divorced because they're not able to give the get. If you find out that at the time of the marriage that the person already had signs of psychosis, you can dissolve that marriage. You don't even need a divorce. It's as if the marriage never happened. And the courts can force doctors to reveal private information about the patients, even against their will. I was involved in a situation not so long ago where a person attempted suicide, was in a vegetative state, was not able to obviously give a divorce settlement. So the Beit Din asked me to find out information that at the time of marriage, 6 months previously, the patient already had some signs of mental illness. They weren't in treatment, but there were some signs, and they dissolved the marriage. So the person continued in a vegetative state, and they dissolved the marriage, and the woman can continue as if the marriage didn't happen. Okay, let's move on, and I'm just going to send. So in terms of there is communal responsibility to look after the mentally ill, and that's something that's very important for us to be sensitive to. And there's responsibility of the community to look after the mentally ill. So we need a close harmony between the scientific and medical developments and the halachic world for the just application of the Talmudic concept. And I just want to end off with this. I mean, if I had to ask how many of you here have ever been to sick visiting in a general hospital, I'm sure all of you have ever done that. All of you have seen someone with pneumonia hospital. But how many of you have ever visited a psychiatry hospital for someone with mental illness, who's not a family member? Very, very few of you. And why is that? Because of the stigma. Now, Jewish law says no, there should be no stigma. And you know, in 25 years of psychiatry, I've never seen anyone ever bring flowers to someone in a psychiatry hospital. The most common illness of anyone in any country in the world in hospital today is not a heart attack, is not broken bones or cancer, it's schizophrenia. But people don't talk about it because, you know, it's hush-hush, we don't talk. Jewish law says no, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, in this country, there's a new hospital set up by the Orthodox community. Where instead of having 10 or 6 people per room and one shower for a whole ward, they opened up a hotel, almost like a hotel standards, for the mentally ill in the middle of Bnei Brak, 7-story hospital in the middle of Bnei Brak, where set up by the Orthodox community, run according to strict halacha, where all the staff are sensitive to issues of cultural for the religious. I mean, it's like a hotel, and it's not this down and out kind of place where, you know, these are hospital rooms, 2 per room, not 10 per room. Everyone is a hospital, you know, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. And I'll just end off with this kind of statement. And it's the only institution in this country, psychiatric institution, where there's no coercion, where there are no restraints and patients have 5-star standards of care, and there should be no reason why not. And I'm just going to end up with this. The greatness of any nation and profession, religion, culture is defined by how they look after the weak. And this is the weak. The weak are the mentally ill. And I think that it's very important that sensitivity is done to that, not just within religion, but within the medical profession as well. Thank you very much.